Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. Today we are creating an awesome palace castle sort of thing. It turned out really great. I'm very happy with the final product. But of course we have to start with wireframing. I did the first part of wireframing off camera because it was a bit time consuming and I was choosing the color palette and it was a bit all over the place. But I started with a massive circle and some smaller circles just on the floor, and then I started filling them in. And I find wireframing is really helpful because it means that you know where all of your shapes are going to be and you understand how it's going to look before you actually spend the time building it and texturing it and doing all the things that you want to do to make it pretty. And I also wanted to use a warm and not like grey sort of color palette, because usually when I build castles I make them out of like stone and like the mid-grey cobblestone, stone brick sort of color palette, but I really wanted to challenge myself to find stone passing blocks that weren't grey. So I ended up with a color palette going from dripstone, which is the greatest block. I'm loving it so much. Thank you, Marianne, for adding it. But dripstone to sandstone, smooth sandstone. And then I put in some light grey terracotta in there and some stripped logs, and I think it looked really cool. The gradient also makes you look up more, and I did vary the gradient between each tower to give it a little bit of contrast so that not everything looked the same and you could distinguish between different towers, which I thought was like very helpful in sort of creating the build with like a gradient and an overall color palette, but also making sure that everything was separate but still combined. And you can see as I go through the build, I decide that I want certain pieces to be slightly bigger or slightly smaller, and I sort of just adjust as I go, but at least I have sort of like a rough guide of what I wanted originally, and then that changes slightly. Also, when texturing, I didn't do what I usually do, which is sort of like mesh the blocks together. I made it so that every time I was combining colors, it was either dripping down or going up, and then it sort of like went to get almost like a zipper. So like one piece, like there is only big, there's no interruption in each material, it just depends on how high I wanted that particular piece to be. Which I think is an interesting way of texturing. I wanted to try it out and I think it turned out quite well. I also used a lot of woods in this build, I'm beginning to realize. I used jungle oak and birch in the texturing of the walls. I used dark oak as a trimming for the roofs, and I used spruce and jungle in the detailing. The only wood I didn't use were the nether woods and acacia. So it was a big wood build for something that I was trying to go for a stone look for, but that's okay. I think that the more I use blocks and different types of blocks, the more diversely I use them. Like I would never have used wood as a castle like wall block like 3 months ago. I also wanted to add in small details like chiseled sandstone, just to add a little bit of variation, a little bit of intricacy to the build. And I also wanted to try out new shapes. I tried to use like mostly domes for the roofs, which is something that I've never really done before. I don't usually do domes, I usually do like pointy roofs, but I think the domes turned out really well, and I also think that the orange they used for them was really good. I think like the entire build is a warm color palette, and usually when I make builds I'll have either the main block be cold or warm, and then I'll have a contrast block which is the opposite. But in this build I just use warm colors, so only like browns. There's a little bit of purple in the dripstone, but not really, like it still passed as a warm block. And then the roofs were orange. So I think this is a very warm and comforting build, I think, for me. I also don't usually use orange in my builds, but here it just seemed to work. Orange is a cool color when you can use it in the right contexts. But figuring out how to do the dome shapes was really time consuming. I don't like to look up sort of like patterns or like templates for how to make domes, so I just sort of trial and error it until it looks good, which is very time consuming, but I'm glad I do it. It's fun for me. What I also did for the detailing was sort of make it less elegant, I guess, because like it is a palace, it is quite elegant, but for the balconies I made them sort of like haphazardly. Like I made the railings not look super neat, and I think that just made it look a little bit older, which is cool. I took inspiration from B-Dubs's season 8 base, or the Big Eye District in Hermitcraft season 8, with the sort of way that the balconies were made, with like varying textures of wood and signs and trapdoors, and I think it looks really good. I think it makes it look quite old, but I think that it complements the everything else in the build. And then later on in the build I did decide that I wanted to create some more smaller towers for like added detail, and like so that there wasn't just like 3 major towers. So I added them all, and again I started at different layers of the gradient to give them a bit of contrast from each other. Then at the bottom I wanted to create sort of like a miniature stand, I guess, sort of like a walkway, like an elevated walkway, but I didn't want it to make it out of stone, so I decided to make it out of spruce, and I think it turned out really well. It was sort of like an experimentative thing where I didn't really know what I was doing, so I sort of just placed blocks and made it in the same style as the balconies, which I wouldn't usually do for something that's so like structural in the build, but I think it turned out really well. I just sort of added like fences and stairs and walls, and then behind it I filled it in with jungle wood planks, and honestly it looked great. It was a bit weird and funky to make and sort of design and think up, but I'm very happy with it. And then finally I added in a little bit of greenery, not heaps, just a few little like pot plants here and there, and a tree at sort of like the first balcony level, because I think that like there's not really much else going on with the floor space, so if I don't add in a tree I don't really know what's supposed to be happening, and greenery is always good. And this is the only place where I used grey in the build, in the trees, which is kind of interesting because usually I do the opposite. I'd use brown for the trees and grey for the for everywhere else, but I think the little pops of slightly contrasting and slightly duller blocks actually made it pop more, because the rest of the build was very colourful and warm, so I think that it worked out really well. And then of course some final touches of detailing with some balconies and some windows. And here's the final build. I hope you enjoyed. If you did enjoy the video, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you very soon for another one.